Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Liz Angoff, and I am an educational psychologist in the Bay Area, California. This is part 2 of our Child Feedback Workshop series. And if you have not had a chance to view part 1, it is available at brainbuildingbook.com under Practitioner Tools. And if you had a chance to view part 1, then you've heard me say that I have spent the last few years trying to figure out how to talk to kids about their testing results, how to explain their diagnosis to them, and how to create a positive and empowering feedback session. One outcome of all of this investigation was this neat tool called the Brain Building Book. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. The Brain Building Book is a tool designed specifically for the younger kindergarten through 5th, 6th grade population. And it turns out that these younger kids are the hardest to talk to. And yet, as we talked about in part 1 of this series, it is imperative that we do so. Because even our youngest clients and students have already started to create a narrative in their minds for why things are hard. And it's often not a helpful one. So we need to start talking to these kids early. But most of us don't, because it's tricky. It's tricky at any age, but especially for this younger crowd. And as I talked about before, there are some really common challenges to effective feedback that keep surfacing. The first is language, finding appropriate, age-appropriate, positive, empowering language. The other is attention, that the younger the child, the more difficult it is to really keep their attention during these types of conversations. The overwhelm of hearing this kind of information, and the time it takes to really put these things together, finding the right metaphor and the right visuals. And not every kid is exactly the same, and so every time putting together an effective feedback session can feel like it's the first time. And then supporting parents. How do we help parents continue this conversation to have that language to really talk to kids in an empowering way and to feel confident that they are really supporting their children in developing their sense of self in that positive and empowering way? So the Brain Building Book was designed as a tool to help with each of these challenges. The language is simple and empowering. The visuals are designed to communicate complex concepts in engaging ways. And the book walks you through a multi-step process, so you are discovering and unpacking the child's profile with the child. It's a broad and flexible template, so you don't have to come up with something unique for every single child, but yet you get to personalize it for every child, so it really is truly unique to them. And then it's a take-home for parents to document the language that you use so that they have a reference and kids have a way to share what they learned with the other adults in this child's life. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually referenced in the practitioner manual, which is available on brainbuildingbook.com. So if you haven't already, you can go ahead and download that as a ready reference. All right, so as we get started, there are a couple basic tips just to keep in mind. And one is that as I'm talking about using this book, I'm talking about starting it at the very first testing session or the first time that I meet the kid. And not everybody in this audience is an assessment professional. And so another way to think about this is that you're introducing these concepts over multiple sessions. So it's really integrated into your work with the child. I also want to encourage you to choose your own order. The book was designed to introduce things piece by piece, but every child is different. And a lot of our children are not linear. And I know that for me, I'm often going through things in a certain order, but then circling back and then maybe taking one step forward and two steps back and making sure that I'm kind of going with the child to really build on these concepts. Annotating is a really important piece. Personalizing this book, writing in it so that that you're writing actively with the child there, so that it's part of the experience of discovering all these cool things about their brain. Less is more. You don't have to put every single thing in the book. It's really just the big key take homes. And then send it home, because that is what's going to really set parents up for that continued conversation. A few additional materials as well that I'm going to be referencing. You want your colorful markers. I have just a kind of a model of the brain that's in my office. It's often fun for kids to be taking apart and playing with as they're listening, or we're talking about different things, so they can physically point. And my favorite are these big plush neurons that we use to talk about making new connections, and how when the connections get stronger, or we're kind of bringing a connection for the first time, and for these younger kids, having something physical again that they can touch, in addition to the book, is just a very helpful way to really drive everything home. All right. And then for introducing just the sessions, and kind of how we break this down, I tend to think about session 1 is the all about you and your brain sessions. And we're using the first 6 pages of the book just to explain why we're here, and in my case, why we're doing this assessment, and learning about them, what they like to do, and kind of introducing some of this vocabulary. The next testing sessions, so I usually test in 3 sessions. So the next sessions are really about discovering the strengths and documenting them, thinking about things that a child has really grown in over time and documenting that, and then identifying the difficulties and documenting that, because that's what's going to set the framework for your feedback session later. And then at the actual feedback session, we finish the last couple pages of the book with the special words, which are the child's diagnosis or the terms that we're going to use to help them understand their brain if there isn't a diagnosis or it's not appropriate to share at this time. Their crew, the people who are going to help them to learn these skills, and then their tools, which are your recommendations, essentially. All right. So as I was iterating on this book, it was actually those variations that kind of brought about these keys to effective feedback. So I kind of had the original concept of having a PowerPoint, like a lot of us do, but that didn't quite work. So we had to figure out what mistake I was making that made that not a very effective feedback tool. And then we started doing things more that were more physical, and that kind of helped one piece, but it didn't help with the overwhelm. And so every time we iterated on this book, and every time I tried something different, it really started to hone in on what mistakes I was making, and then what were really the most important things to remember in order to make sure that I was consistently offering really high quality, effective feedback. And again, we went into depth in these in the first webinar. So if you haven't seen that yet, go ahead and reference that. So the first key is feedback starts before intake. And essentially what we mean here is that feedback is integrated throughout the entire assessment session, the entire assessment process, both with the parents and with the child. The second thing that the book is going to help you do is build this shared language. So the language that we use is so important, and I started to realize that we really had to build that together. It wasn't enough just to get the child's description. Offering them language is so important, and so I wanted to make sure that the tool that I used had that language there to offer, as well as a way to document their language, so it was all there together. The other thing you'll see as we break down how to use the book is that we're really making sure that there are no surprises at the feedback session. And actually, what we write down, I go back to that to see, okay, where are we starting and what are we going to cover in that feedback session? Because I don't want to be introducing anything new. And then the ongoing conversation, realizing that the goal of the feedback session was actually not for kids to fully understand everything that was going on. The goal was actually to get the conversation started and give parents the tools to keep it going. Because having this idea that we were going to accomplish all of that in a single hour, in a single point in time, with all the different factors that can come in there, not to mention just what happened that morning for the child and how ready they are to learn something. The most effective thing that I could do was really make sure that we were setting parents, caregivers, teachers up to keep that conversation going with the child. So today we're really going to look at how these things map onto the book, or how the book maps onto these keys for being really effective in your feedback. So this feedback starts before intake. As I said, this is really about integrating your feedback throughout the process. And last time in the last webinar, we talked about how this handout can be really helpful for parents because it has that language of how to introduce the growth mindset, discovery process of assessment. But now that we're using the book, we're going to add a preview of the brain building book with parents. And so the reason that we preview it is because we're showing the parents that we're going to be building this, we're going to be doing this very intentionally and building a vocabulary with the child over time. And it lets them know that we're going to have something to reflect on after every session. So the idea that feedback is being integrated, we're sharing information with the child all along through this book, but also after every session, now the parents know what to expect, we can just kind of show them, oh, we went through this page, we learned a little bit about the different parts of the brain today, and here are some of the things that we talked about. Now the parents are getting a little bit of feedback about the process and how their child is engaging. And there's often opportunities to throw some stuff out there like, oh, we learned a really cool thing today. When Johnny hears stories, his brain just takes them in and they stick like glue. But when I'm giving him just kind of random information, it's really hard for it to stick. So we learned that stories are a great way for him to learn new information. That was a cool thing. So I'm able to start kind of showing these things. And the other way that this really integrates the feedback into the process is that I've heard from so many families that this often will inspire conversation on the way home. What else did you learn? And so the child is rehearsing these concepts, parents getting a little bit of information, and it's really helpful for inspiring that curiosity to build up to that feedback session when we're going to bring everything together. All right. So let's talk about building the shared language and diving into this book. So the first section of the book, we are going to use these first couple of pages to explain why we're here. We're going to build rapport and give children the language to start asking questions by introducing that brain-based language. And we're also going to hear how they describe their challenges and strengths and document it. So we have both pieces coming in. And we're establishing a growth mindset, which is really going to take us through assessment, because we're establishing at the beginning that we are building your brain. You are constantly building your brain. And even through this assessment, we're going to be doing things that your brain has never seen before, and it's going to have to make a new connection. So even in here with me, you're going to build your brain. And for some of the things we might get there today, and for some of them you might not get there today, but your brain is still making connections and it's on its way. And that sets the foundation for when we get to those hard, tricky spots to say, oh, this might be something your brain hasn't quite built a strong connection for yet. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Tell me a little bit more why it's hard. Um, and it's setting the child up to talk about the hard things with curiosity rather than trying to avoid them, or you've already got that vocabulary going. So this is page 1 of the book. And this is just introducing the idea that you have an amazing brain in your head and we are about to talk about it. So I might say, we're here to learn about your brain. Brains are amazing. They all have different parts they all have parts that are pretty similar, but everyone's brain does things a little bit differently. And we're going to do a bunch of different things that will help us discover how your unique brain works, what's going to be most helpful for the things that you want to do. So I might ask them, what are some things you already know about the brain? Have you learned about the brain at all in class? Because a lot of kids have, and that's a fun way to start. And if they haven't, I say, oh, goody, because I get to teach you some really cool stuff. And then the next 2 pages are that brain-based vocabulary. And so if you notice, these pages have labels that are intentionally simple so that even our littlest kiddos can see that the brain has lots of different parts that work together. And part of the joy of being able to annotate this is that I can make it as complex as I want for some of my older kids or kids who have more interest. So the first thing that I ask kids is, all right, so your brain has different parts that help you do the things that you like to do. And there are parts that help you understand what you hear, understand what you see, help you know where things are, help you pay attention and make decisions, and help you stay balanced and coordinated. And there are also parts that are in charge of emotions, memory, getting that information in from your senses, and these parts really keep you safe. So tell me something that you really like to do. And we take that thing that they really like to do and we apply these labels, these kind of concepts to that thing. So now that you know a little bit about the different parts of the brain, how do you think you use these parts to do your favorite thing? And for this child, it was rock climbing. So we talked about that rock climbing requires a lot of balance and coordination, of course. She said that what she sees is really important because she needs to see the different holds and the different colors and the different shapes that tell her what her pathway is. She needs to know where her body is in space so that she can keep track of what limb is going where and really be able to visualize her path kind of going up to create her route. She has to listen to her partner who is there to keep her safe. And then she said that attention and decisions, we were talking about things she has to do up on the wall, and she said, what part of my brain is in charge of knowing when to relax? Because I always have to make sure I'm doing that. So we talked about how the frontal lobe can be the part that kind of sends messages to the other parts of her brain to say, okay, we don't need to be nervous. We know how to do this. We're tethered, and we can relax, and that's going to help. So you'll notice that there's some other annotations on here too. And that's because, as I said before, I always come back to different pages throughout the assessment. So at one point we were talking about how her reading has improved so much. And we talked about some of the parts of the brain that are involved in reading. And then at the feedback session, she was diagnosed with dysgraphia. And so we talked about how writing has lots of different parts, and some of the parts of writing she's actually very skillful at, like coming up with ideas and using her imagination. but handwriting is hard, and then organizing those ideas is hard. And so we came, back to the brain to kind of put those things on the map so she could get a better sense of what she's working on. We also looked at her emotional brain. So how does your emotional brain help with rock climbing? And so we talked about how her amygdala is going to keep her safe, and it's going to let her know if something is dangerous, and help her body react really quickly. Her memory is also really important to make decisions about what she should do at any given time. And then her senses are taking in information from around her to make sure that she is responding appropriately. And so her brain is helping her to do the things that she really likes to do. And the same thing that we might come back here later if there are some difficulties in the area of emotional regulation, sensory processing, that sometimes your brain is trying to keep you safe but might not be as skillful or helpful, or might be kind of miscuing on things like the alarm that goes off when it doesn't need to go off. But we've already established that this part of our brain is helpful and does some really important things for us before we go into the challenges. All right, so if you are playing with us at home, you can pause the video here and think about a child that you've been working with and something that they really like to do. And take a second to try out, how would you explain how the different parts of the brain help them to do that thing? And again, your explanation can be as simple or as complex as you would like it to be, based on your child and your own knowledge of the brain, and what would be most helpful for them. And then this information will help us because we're building up towards explaining the diagnosis to a child. So all of these words that we come up with are actually super important for getting to that end goal. All right, so the next piece, this is a page that I often will touch on during this initial part, but more often than not, I'm coming back here later for kids who really struggle with emotional regulation and what I often refer to as big feelings. So in this first pass though, I will often say that when we're feeling anxious and frustrated, these parts of our brain take action to make sure that we stay safe. And they're really good at getting our bodies to do things like run from danger, like from a charging tiger. Though sometimes it's hard for these parts to tell the difference between a tiger and a math test. So sometimes we're going to have some really big feelings, and sometimes that's going to be a true alarm, and sometimes it might be that this part of our brain is sounding a much louder alarm than it needs to at that moment. And the front part of our brain has a really important job here. It kind of acts like the boss of our brain and helps us to create a plan and make good decisions when we are having a hard time. And the boss gets better and better at his job as we get older. But feelings can have a big impact on what we do. And sometimes when we're having big feelings, it's hard to think. So when you're frustrated, for example, it can be hard to keep going on your homework. Has that ever happened to you? And I find often that for the kids, this is not a big deal for. They're able to talk really easily about it here. For kids that it is a big deal for, this is a very vulnerable conversation. And so I might come back to it a little bit later. Just introduce the concept that big feelings make it hard to think. We might talk about that a little bit later. And you can think about if that's something that's ever happened for you. Let me move on. When we do come back, or if the child's ready in that moment, sometimes what I'll ask is, what kinds of things have been hard that have kind of brought about those big feelings, and what do you do in those moments? How does the boss help you out in those moments? What is the boss learning how to do? What have you discovered that works? And so for this child, he told me I take deep breaths, I hang out with my cat, listen to music, and talk to my friends. And that's what I do when my big feelings are making it hard for me to think, so that I can start thinking again. And then I end this section, usually before I start the official testing, with introducing this metaphor of a brain under construction. So your brain works by sending messages from one part to another using special cells called neurons. And these are big, giant neurons that, and in your head, they are much smaller and don't have googly eyes. But these help to illustrate the point that your brain is always making new connections. And so as we work together, we're going to be doing different activities that show us the different ways that your brain works. And so the different ways that your brain works. And we will talk about how we make those connections, and that over time, as we get better and better at things, the connections become even stronger and stronger. And some of the things that we do today will be things that you already know how to do really well. They'll feel easy, and that's because you have a really strong, big, thick highway type road in your brain for that kind of information. Other things will feel really hard. And that might be because it's a construction zone, or because it's a new connection, or maybe you just have never made that connection before. But I want you to try your best, because who knows, you might make a connection today. And I love introducing the testing this way, that we're going to discover how your brain approaches different types of problems, what's hard, what comes easily, because it sets us up for a really successful feedback session. When I introduce testing as a bunch of games that are going to be really fun and you're going to get a prize afterwards, it's completely disconnected from the end goal, which is understanding your brain. And what I found is I could engage kids a lot in testing with, I think we're playing a game and we're going to have a reward. And it's not that we don't have fun. So some of these things will feel like games, but my emphasis is not on that, because I found that when we got to the feedback session, kids were kind of given a little bit of mental whiplash of, wait a minute, I thought we were playing games and now you found something out? What happened? So having the neurons also helps me stay on theme. And after every subtest, we a little neuron high five to celebrate that we made a new connection. All right. So now we're kind of into the assessment. This is day 2 or your afternoon, or maybe a subsequent session if you are working in more of a post-assessment capacity. But now what we're doing is really trying to build our vocabulary so that there's no big reveal. So we've already talked about a lot of these strengths and a lot of the challenges. So when we get to the feedback session, we can actually use those words to explain what's going on. We're going to try and get their questions, and this book is really pulling for those questions through all these different pages that we're writing down on. And of course, we're documenting their words so that we can come back to them. And we're going to build their diagnosis together, because at the end of the day, when we go to analyze the data, we're looking at strengths and challenges, and that pattern is what tells us that this child is autistic, or this child is an ADHDer, or this child has some concerns here and there, and we should really monitor for them. But there's a profile that we're looking for, and we're trying to match that with different patterns that we see in a lot of other kids, and that's kind of how we come to our diagnosis. So if we're pointing out to the child, these are some of your strengths, these are some of your challenges, and when we put all that together, it's a pattern we recognize and we call that ADHD. It's a repackaging. The diagnosis becomes a repackaging, but not a surprise. So we're going to build this together. So At the beginning of my second day with the child, I say that we're gonna do some more work in the book, and that there are some things that our brains make easy for us to do, and these are your brain's highways. That's where the connections are super strong. And it might be because something comes naturally, or it might be something that you've practiced a lot. So, what are some of the things that come easily to your brain? And chances are we've talked about some of these things already, so I might write down some examples. Or it might be a good time to ask them a little more about what are some of your favorite classes, or your teacher said this. Do you agree with that? Or some of the testing we've already done. Remember yesterday when I gave you those blocks? That seemed like something your brain really liked to do that came pretty easily. Would you agree that's one of your highways? If I already have some data in mind, especially if that data is going to be important later on for somebody who's really a visual spatial thinker, and I want to be able to kind of introduce those ideas early. So this is what this might look like. And you'll see there are different colors here because we were writing on different days, and I usually ask the kid, what color should I write in? You noticed before there was a picture of a child writing in the book. So often I'll invite the child to write. For a lot of kids, I see a lot of kids with writing challenges, so I might not, they might not want to write, but I might offer them to draw pictures or anything else. But in this case, I always ask them, what color should I write in? So this child, we had done the Woodcock Johnson, and he just killed concept formation. And not only did he get through every single one of them, but he asked for more. He was really sad that the test was over. So we talked about how that was looking at things like being able to see patterns. And during a writing, like a battery of writing tests, which is an area that's really hard for this child, he had mentioned that he does really well with compare contrast, that that's easier for him to think about, and that if he does have to write, he would rather write compare contrast. So that felt like good information to know about his brain. I wasn't really sure where it was going yet, but it turned out that having things later on, it turned out that having things that are really concrete, so the concepts are already there, made it a lot easier for him to kind of build off of that, as opposed to coming up with something from thin air from his imagination. This was really helpful for him. Problem solving skills in general, his memory, super sticky for some types of information. And he had done really well on some memory tests, and I asked him why. And he said, or I asked him, what was that like for you? How did you do that? Did you have any strategies? And he says, I used the flashlights in the story. That I've never heard that before. Tell me more about that. And he said, the flashlights are the key points in the story that then you can use that to shine light on all the other little details. So if a story is boring, it's because it doesn't have many flashlights and it's hard to keep track of all of the pieces. But if there are flashlights, then it's easier. So using his words, we're able to use flashlights as some terminology that helped us later to talk about attention and how to manage attention. So after talking about strengths, it makes sense to then talk about things that are hard. And this is what made sense to me when I first, kind of during some of the first iterations. But it happened more than once that kids would shut down when I turned around and said, now what's challenging? And in some cases, kids would even shut down to the point that they would go back to the highways page and cross out everything and say, I'm not good at anything, I'm not bad at anything, I just not anything. I thought this was really, really interesting, that there was such a point of vulnerability for these young kids. And I wasn't having the same challenge with older kids who seemed more than happy to tell me all the things that were a problem. And So there was something really interesting about hitting this point of vulnerability for elementary school students who are working so hard to to meet expectations of the adults around them. And trying so hard to hide the things that are challenging. And so it was almost as if I would turn the page and I was asking them to reveal the most vulnerable and sensitive and tender parts of themselves. So I put something in between and it made all the difference. And that's where these pages come from. So when you try something new or difficult, it may take a little longer for messages to get to where they need to go. And that's because the roads are still under construction. So for example, when you were little, you may remember that at first it was hard to what? What is something that used to be hard that is now a lot easier? And a lot of times kids do have something to say, something they're really proud of learning. Um, like a new video game level, or like my rock climbing child who had really made huge progress in reading and was so excited. And sometimes kids don't really know what to put here, but most elementary school kids remember learning to ride a bike, learning how to swim, or walking. They might not remember learning how to walk, but they know that there was a time that they couldn't walk and a time that they could walk. And they may have a younger sibling that they or cousin or somebody who they've kind of watched go through those steps. And so even just putting down walking just shifts their mind into, oh, I'm building my brain and I've done this before. So now I can say, great. Let's think about what you want your next construction project to be. So I want you to think about something that's kind of hard now that we can do the same thing with and get better at. So sometimes your brain doesn't make it easy for you to get from one place to another. When you're having a tough time, you might feel frustrated, embarrassed, or tired. And so I don't know if you've had these experiences, but do you have an example of something that might be hard now that you want to kind of work on to get better? And this often will produce an answer. It might not seem at first related to the assessment question, but we open the door to get there. And as I said, we circle back a lot. So once we've kind of established that there are things you're working on and that's okay, it could be a new video game level. It could be Spanish class when the referral question has everything to do with anxiety. It could be anything, but it's going to open the door to really talking about things. And then when we hit those parts of the testing that are harder, now we can ask, is this one of your, do you think this might be one of your construction zones? Is this something that your brain has to work really hard to do? I bet you we can figure out why. And we can help you build a new road. Because your brain is making new connections every day. Zzz. And with a little help and some great tools, you can make those tricky roads much easier to travel. And we're going to figure that out together. So this is a child who was having some writing challenges, some social challenges, and some attention challenges, which all of these things often go together. And so we had hit those writing. I think when I first came here, I was like, I don't know. It's like, well, let's think about it. And then we hit those writing tests. And he's like, I don't want to do this. So we put them here. Like, so what's challenging about writing? What's hard about it? And he said, I can't even think about an idea. Once I think of ideas, I have too many. I don't even know how to choose an idea. It goes too slow. I hate the whole process. Well, okay, well, let's see if we can figure out a way to help make this a little easier. And then later on, we were talking about social interactions and friends. And he said, you know, it's hard to make friends now because most of my friends like to do sports. And I'm trying to figure out if I should try and do sports too. I don't like them, but maybe I should try harder to like them. Poor kid. So we put this down, and this question was going to give me a space to talk about some of um, the social challenges that this child was facing and some of the interventions that we were going to put into place to kind of help, including helping him be confident that he doesn't have to do sports just to make friends if he doesn't like sports. And then remembering the boring parts of the story, which is this is our flashlight child. So when a story doesn't have flashlights, how do you remember it? All right. So again, if you're playing at home, this is a great time to pause the video and just take a second to reflect. What would you actually write in these pages for the child that you brought to mind earlier? Because when we write things down, it does have to be translated into kid-friendly language. So how would the child describe it? And you're not with the child right now, so it's a little harder to, it can be harder to come up with that when you don't have the child in your ear. But if you worked with this child recently, think about what they might have said. And to take a stab at writing those things here. Okay, so the next key to effective feedback, as I said, is that ongoing conversation. And in the first webinar, we talked about using this assessment summary sheet for that ongoing conversation. That this is a really simple way to document the key points in kid-friendly language so that parents have this language, teachers have this language. But now you get to document this language using the book. So understanding is not a journey. Understanding is a journey, not an event. We want to set parents and caregivers up for success. That is the goal of feedback, is to set parents and caregivers up for success, teachers, tutors, because we're going to do our best to really help this child understand, but we're not going to be able to do it all in one single session on a random day in this child's life. We are going to start the wheels turning. That is a success. If we can start the wheels turning, if we can get that child to start thinking in that kind of curious way, get them to walk out with a few new words that are really going to help them, and then make sure that the adults in their life have the means to really support them in continuing to grow their understanding. And we're encouraging self-advocacy with these words. And the more they can self-advocate, the more they are having these conversations with their teachers and tutors and coaches, and the people that they show these things to can really help. So if you notice, these 4 pages are exactly the same as these 4 boxes. So we have highways, construction zones, our helpful words, which is going to be the diagnosis, and then the tools. And there's a construction crew there too, which are the people that are going to help to implement the tools and give supports. But these are essentially these 4 pages. So we're going to take the highways and the construction zones, and we're going to bring them together to help define this new word that we're going to introduce. And again, it's new, but it's not surprising because we're using the child's words and we're using the things we've already talked about to introduce this new concept. And the way I like to think of defining a diagnosis for a child is by using this sentence frame here, essentially, as my starting point. So we all have things that make some situations easier than others. And in our work together, we learned that your brain is built in a way that makes your highways come easily and your construction zones much more difficult. It turns out you're not alone. This pattern happens a lot. We call it this word. Now that we know our job is to maximize your amazing superpowers and find ways to build those trickier skills so that the hard part gets easier. Let's make a plan. So we have jumped into the actual feedback session. Testing is over. Child is back in our office, and we're telling them, this is what we learned together. So the helpful words page, this is the hardest page to fill in, at least for me. This is where kind of everything is coming together. And we're going to identify some specific words that the child can use to describe their strengths and challenges. It can be a diagnosis or another term that's helpful. We're going to define these words in a child-friendly way and demystify or destigmatize the diagnosis. So here's an example of how this comes together. So this is a child who's dyslexic, who is really creative, love to build things, take things apart, but was just having a lot of trouble gaining fluency, even after a lot of reading intervention. So his definition of dyslexia is that his brain is built in a way that makes creativity, problem solving, and building things easy, but can make reading quickly and spelling hard. So this is what dyslexia means for him. It might mean something slightly different for another child, but for him, these are the things that go together to tell us that dyslexia makes sense, and he's not alone. This is a child who did not have a firm diagnosis. There were a number of things going on for this child, a lot of which were kind of in development. So some concerns about mental health that weren't diagnosable at the time, but we really wanted to keep an eye on because of various factors in this child's profile. But it was a really tricky feedback just in helping parents to really understand where I came to diagnostically, because it wasn't firm. And actually, I felt it was in the child's best interest not to name things right at that moment. But there were some really specific things to understand about him that helped bring everything together. And one of those was processing time. And that's the term that I chose that was kind of a really important take-home term, because having slower processing speed meant that being asked a question in the middle of class was super anxiety provoking. Being in a big group of kids where all the banter, as he was getting older, all the banter is getting quicker and quicker, was very stressful and resulted in some different kinds of ways to cope with that. But he did really well one-on-one with friends, and he did really well when he had time to process information. And his parents had started to notice this at home and were kind of giving him more time. So his special words were processing time, and his diagnosis statement was, my brain works best when I have lots of time to think about my answer. So this is really going to help connect the things that we're going to do to help him and help him to self-advocate, like, hey, I need time to process. So now you get to bring these things together. So this is another time you can pause the video and think about, for the child that you've been kind of writing about throughout, how would you define their diagnosis? So if they have a firm diagnosis, you can use that kind of basic sentence frame. Your diagnosis means your brain is built in a way that makes these things easy and these things much more challenging. Or another way you can do it is think about a special, a term that would be really helpful. And using the sentence frame, my brain works best when. And there is a handout that I'll link to either on the page where you found this video or in the description below the YouTube video. There is a Google Doc called Creating a Child-Friendly Diagnosis. And you'll see that there's a couple examples of different diagnoses, and you can look at examples of strengths, examples of challenges, and then examples of the kind of way we've brought those together, so you can create one for your child. I also included some of those additional terms, like processing time. I often am using executive functioning. organization, motivation, breaking that into its component parts and showing that it's a skill and not a personal quality of laziness is really helpful for kids. And you can try out these definitions and see what you might say to the child that you've had in mind. After I present the diagnosis to the child, it's often a good time to just step away from the book for a second and show them a video or a visual, a book that can help to illustrate what we're talking about. So not needed, but often a really fun time to do this. And so I have this spreadsheet called Tools for Explaining Testing Results. And again, the link is going to be in the description in the YouTube video or on the web page. You can find a link here. And there are tabs on this for ADHD, which you see here. Also, autism, emotional challenges, dyslexia, giftedness, general, kind of more general ones, and I'm adding to it all the time. So these can be some fun things to show to a child. For example, for my ADHD kids, I almost always show them the How to ADHD video, my 10 favorite things about having ADHD. And it's really cute to show them with their parents because often the parent is going, that's you. That one's you too. I totally see that in you. That's one of your strengths. And it's a really neat way to kind of wrap up the session. The construction crew, to help you learn these skills, there's some new people we might be adding to your team. It's a great time to say, like, you're going to be working with a resource specialist, or we're going to be looking at somebody called an educational therapist for you to work with. It's also nice to ask who's been most helpful, who is on your crew. A lot of times, kids will say parents as their first person, and so if there's there's a parent there with them, that can be a really cute and meaningful experience. But also hearing from the child who's been helpful and who hasn't been can be illuminating. Tools page. Here are some things that are going to help you. We're going to talk through some of the key recommendations. I recommend just writing a couple in here, and the ones that are going to be either a new service or something that teachers or parents will be doing differently, so the child knows that that's happening and why. So an example for our processing time child is that I asked him, what's most helpful for you? And he said, brain food grows my brain, like dried raspberries. Okay, we'll put that down. We talked about rock climbing as a sport that would be helpful because it's one-on-one, but still with a group. And then I told him about wait time, that his teachers were going to be giving him more wait time. And you can imagine that this is a kid who the teachers might have that recommendation, but if he doesn't know why it's happening, it could just make him more anxious. Like, why aren't they moving on? He's going to start some social skills classes, so we needed to establish why those were there. And then we also talked about theater and acting, and he wrote this down, and then he's like, how is that going to help me? And so we talked about when you don't have enough time to process what's going on in a group dynamic, sometimes some improv skills could actually be really helpful for helping you feel more comfortable in those moments.
So I'm going to keep it?
You're going to keep it. It's yours. Yeah.
Cool.
So, of course, the end of this and the main thing that really makes this a great tool for ensuring that this conversation is ongoing is that kids get to take it home. And so many kids are so excited to bring this home, to share it with their teachers, and to bring it to an IEP meeting. And it is amazing to see an elementary school kid walk into their IEP meeting and say, I want to tell you something about my brain. And to start it that young is such a powerful experience. So I did develop a parent guide that you can reference and is on the brainbuildingbook.com website. And that's a one pager you can give to parents that they can use so they know kind of how to keep this going. And I think that is it. Hopefully, this has been helpful for walking you through how to use this book. Um, Through the end of September, I have a coupon code and for 10% off a brain building book purchase at brainbuildingbook.com. Your code is BBB10. And then if you think that these neurons would be helpful, they've been so helpful for me. Giant Microbes, the company, has actually given us a 20% discount code. So you're welcome to use that. And that's good at least until the end of the year. And that's Dr. Liz 20QY right there. All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here. Please reach out if you have any questions at all. And thank you for all the amazing work you've been doing, helping kids to build their brains.